Crusaider. Adventures of the Allain de Bures. First book. Return to Jerusalem. By onur diler in 2022. Part 1. Return to Jerusalem. The grand dining hall had been transformed into a courtroom. Light streamed through the large, arched windows at the top of the high walls, adorned with painstakingly crafted stained glass decorations in pastel colors, modestly embellishing the hall. White cloths were laid over a long table, and on either side of it hung the Red Cross symbols, emblematic of the Knights Templar. Only copper pitchers and goblets adorned the table. 20 elderly men, clad in robes, sat quietly behind the table. On the wall behind them, 9 swords and 9 shields were hung in remembrance of the 9 knights who founded the brotherhood. The man in the middle of the table nodded his head at the robed figure standing by the door, a black-robed priest. The black-robed man respectfully bowed at the waist and saluted the table after opening the door, saying, "They are waiting for you." The bulky man who entered was fully equipped, adorned in well-maintained chainmail armor. At his waist, he carried a sword with a crimson hilt and pommel, its length standard, but the hilt extending half a hand longer than usual. A conical helmet with intricate patterns and a double-headed eagle emblem adorned his head. Advancing with confident yet dignified steps, the knight stopped a few meters from the table, acknowledging it with a nod of his head. The monk who had let him in closed the door, prompting a blue-robed knight seated at the end of the table to rise. The elderly man sported long mustaches curled upwards. "This will not be a trial, holy knight. What is spoken here shall stay here and not be repeated outside. Do you understand?" the aged man asked. "Yes, my lord," replied the sturdy man. "A copy of the recorded transcripts will be made and sent to the Vatican with your signature. Therefore, here, in the presence of witnesses and God, do you swear to speak the truth, and only the truth?" "I swear, my lord." Throughout the hall and on both sides of the door, Knights Templar, clad in chainmail and wearing white robes with conical helmets, stood. Their long shields with red crosses were placed before them. On the left side of the temple, the commander of these guards stood with 2 men behind him. On the right, 3 monks held meeting notes and acted as scribes. As the speakers talked, the quill pens in the hands of these monks came to life, their tips rustling across thick parchments. "During this inquiry, I, Marshal Godfrey de Sonnac, will be the inquisitor of the meeting," the man declared, waiting for the monks to note his name. When the quills ceased their movement, he continued, "Please introduce yourself to the High Council, Holy Knight." "I am." The man began calmly. The caravan, advancing from south to north, kicked up dust, scattering it over the dried shrubs and trees. The man riding the sturdy, tired bay horse that silently moved through the dust resembled more of a desert nomad. Towering over the caravanners passing by on his large warhorse, he appeared like a giant. Adhering to the traditions of these barren lands, he wore white or cream-colored robes, belts, and cloaks, resembling more a nomad than the people of the western lands from where he hailed. As he passed through the dust, creating clouds that enveloped the olive trees, a young man, dressed in black, emerged behind the rider. His black attire was now dust-covered, and his short red hair, much like his master's, was concealed within the folds of his headscarf. The young man, wearing thick leather boots uncommon in these parts, revealed daggers strapped to the sides of his boots. His sharp dark blue eyes squinted as he constantly surveyed his surroundings, resembling a hawk. It was as if he expected a horde of attackers to spring from beneath the sands. A keen observer could easily discern that being alert had become a part of the young man's life. He had hung his long sword on his horse and walked closely to his master, trailing behind 2 bedraggled mules. 2 riders followed them, both shrouded in capes used as shade against the sun. With their gray and light brown-toned capes, it was challenging to distinguish them from the dust clouds. In these barren lands, the sun ruled everything, and the wind blew as if to make everyone forget. The scorching heat felt like a hammer on one's head, making life weary, preventing contemplation. Perhaps that's why everyone acted mad in these lands, killing each other for things they hadn't seen or heard for centuries. Maybe they were right, and he had lost his mind. Who could know the truth? When they reached the top of the dusty slope, the man on the warhorse, using his thick, powerful fingers, pulled down the thin fabric covering his face. The daylight gleamed on the knight's ring on his finger. The ring was turned inward, and its head was not visible. Lowering his sharp-featured face by pulling down his mask, the man looked at the high-walled city with dark green eyes beneath his thick, furrowed brows. The man, bearing a deep scar on the left side of his face, slowed his horse and, looking at the young man who had caught up, said in his thick, almost rusty voice, "We've arrived in Jerusalem." The young man looked at the city walls, the crowd passing through the wide gate, and then turned his gaze back to the man on the horse. "Indeed, a holy city, almost for every religion," the young man replied without the man saying anything. Then he turned his head to the city, sighed, he truly hated this city. There were few trees outside, the trees that were once cut down to prevent the city from falling into Christian hands had not been replanted, not allowed to grow again. They had been waiting for almost a century for Muslims to return for revenge. Beyond the bare walls, there were sporadic houses, mostly farms. These farms were mostly located in the other part of the hilly area where Jerusalem was settled because the water and fertile lands needed for a farm were on this side, and they did not want to be looted when the siege time came. As they approached the Damascus Gate, they encountered a crowd of farmers bringing their harvested goods from the surrounding farms to be sold at the market that day. The market was bustling with the products brought out from the city or acquired within it. The Grand Gate was constructed as a part of the northern walls of Jerusalem, instilling confidence with its thick, solid structure. Despite all the movement, guards stepped forward to halt them as they approached. The city guards had the authority to deny entry or question anyone they deemed foreign or suspicious. The oldest among the chainmail-clad and conical-helmeted guards on large horses asked the man on the grand horse, "Your name and your business in the city?" The man spoke as he lowered his hood, looking around. His horse was surrounded by 4 men, but there were 4 more individuals nearby. The city guards were trained by the knights, the true rulers of the city, and they took military discipline very seriously. "Titus Morgan," the man said, handing a rolled-up paper from his belt to the young city guard in front of him. The guard, covered in dust like everything else, handed the paper to the elderly man. Among their group, the elderly soldier was the only one who could read and write. The old man looked at Titus de Morgan's papers with stern eyes and asked, glancing at the sword hanging from his belt and seemingly lost under the fabrics, "Business or pilgrimage?" "Both," Titus replied. The elderly man glanced at the young man and the 2 riders quietly waiting behind and handed the papers back to the young man, asking, "Your servants?" "Yes," the young man said, handing the papers to the large man. He then calmly asked, "Is there a problem?" People were rarely questioned at the gate. "Routine check," said the old man, then signaled for his men to resume their positions, stating, "You may enter." As the small group entered without rushing, the elderly soldier, who watched them closely, called one of the city guards beside him and whispered something in his ear. Those nearby could only hear the words, "Hurry. He's here." The young man gazed at the thick and towering walls. The daylight was cut off, and the shadows sprawl concealed the entire city behind it. The sunlight, struggling to overcome, spilled over Jerusalem like golden pillars, lifting with the airborne dust. The city had already awakened, and the market stalls of the alert shopkeepers were open. Wooden shutters on the windows of the houses converted into shops on the lower floors had been opened. The young man grumbled in discomfort. The crowd overwhelmed him, making him feel lost or squeezed like a tightened rope. As he maneuvered through the crowd, he could see people of almost every religion wandering the streets. Some were Muslims, some Jews, some Christians. Some had fair skin, some were wheat-toned, and some were dark-skinned. The streets were filled with merchants shouting to advertise their goods, customers bargaining, and people inspecting merchandise. Amidst them were those embarking on business, pilgrims with crosses, or those just looking to pass the time. After passing the block formed by the first houses, 2 riders following them caught up, lowering the thin veils covering their faces. One was Chinese, a quite beautiful woman, and the other was Mongolian. The Mongol greeted the large man with a nod, and the 2 turned their horses eastward, riding away without exchanging greetings or farewells. The large man and his young follower turned eastward, entering another street. At the end of the street, partially paved with stones, the young man heard a loud and echoing noise. When he looked in that direction, he saw a large crowd shouting in chaos. They were shouting different things in different languages. Curiously, he looked at the man on horseback. The rider sighed, saying, "Pilgrims. That's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre," he added, pointing to their progress. "One of the holiest places in Jerusalem. The church is considered the site where Jesus was crucified, buried, and resurrected," he explained to the young man following him. "But sometimes, everyone wants to see and pray there at the same time." He paused to let a group of elderly crusaders pass, smiling and bowing his head in acknowledgement as an old man stopped and prayed for him, saying, "Amen." After the group passed, he continued, "Where were we? An important Christian pilgrimage site and worship center, but sometimes everyone wants to be there at once." Being a holy city greatly benefited the shopkeepers. Almost every shop sold portable religious items and souvenirs that pilgrims could purchase. Rosaries, crosses, prayer rugs, and hats were prominently displayed at the entrances of almost every shop. In the cobblestone streets, the sounds of horseshoes mingled with the sellers, and in the distance, they began to hear the sound of music. A few young men were making music with lutes, oud, and a string drum in a small group in front of a shop. In reality, one of them was probably trying out one of the musical instruments in the shop. Despite the discordant tone, they sang a boldly provocative tavern song, capturing the attention of the entire street. Their carefree joy was radiant enough to dispel the sorrow and fatigue hanging over the people. Even the black-clad young man, who trailed along with his mules, found himself smiling without realizing it. This was a rare sight. As he noticed his smile, he quickly covered his face with the end of his black linen headscarf, seemingly embarrassed. At the corner they turned, they saw a priest in black robes watching those young men with a furrowed brow. The priest grumbled with anger, muttering, "Infidelity. Sin. In such a holy place." As he clenched his robe with one hand and his staff with the other. Both travelers continued on their way, paying little attention to him. As they progressed through the streets, the earthen structure rose, allowing daylight to reach homes and streets. The light, filtering through the buildings, turned into tangible golden bundles thanks to the dust, and the smells of food and spices that could make one's stomach rumble began to emerge. The streets they now traversed were calmer and cleaner. 2 city guards patrolled indifferently. Some women were completely covered, some partially, shielding their eyes or protecting themselves from the sun. The young man paid them no mind, rather contemplating how people could live within these stone walls. He was not accustomed to such things. At this point, they arrived at a small fortress guarded by sentinels in white robes with red crosses on them, both on the walls and at the gate. The large building, unintentionally transformed into a temple while trying to build an inner fortress, was surrounded by a 3 to 4 meter wall. The place they reached belonged to the military order and the king, known as the Templars. King Baldwin had allocated a portion of the Solomon's Temple, where he himself resided, to them. Now the Templars used this place as their headquarters. The entrance to the fortress was marked only by the white and red cross banners of the Templar Knights and the king's flags. The man sighed again, as if reluctant to face the inevitable. As the cart pulled by 2 elderly horses approached, the large man stepped aside. At that moment, 5 knights emerged from the gate. Clad in chainmail, they wore their usual white and red cross embroidered robes over their armor, shields hung on their backs, and spears in hand. They were the leaders of the Templar Knights, younger and bulkier than the others. Disregarding them, the mounted man swiftly advanced towards them, shouting to the young man in his way, "Move aside." However, the young man, trapped between a wall and a cart, had no room to retreat. The knight, riding a white horse, pressed forward, cornering the young man, and struck him twice with his whip. "How dare you still stand there?" The young man raised his arm and reached into his robe, but the departure of the old man's cart forced the young knight and his men to swiftly retreat on their horses. The young man looked at his master, his face expressionless. The large man, glancing at the departing group, cheerfully asked, "Are you okay? Did it hurt?" It was evident that the large man found the young man's anger amusing. Now, as I reflect, I wonder if the mounted warrior laughed at the events at that moment or at what was yet to come. You will see as you read my story that the two passengers were not ordinary people. The young man responded to his impertinent master with a cold stare. However, the man on the horse continued to chuckle, sometimes acting quite childishly and vulgarly. When the warrior on horseback made sure that the street commotion had subsided, he looked with interest at the beggar across from him, as if contemplating something. Then, abandoning his thoughts, he pulled the reins and began to move towards the gate. The young man, who had already distanced himself, cast one last glance at the riders and led the mules along. Seeing him, the gatekeepers straightened their posture, while those on the wall openly directed their attention to him. Regardless of his concerns, they wouldn't allow a Saracen on a war horse to enter. As the man with the horse slowly approached, the gatekeepers were skilled enough to feign indifference. Slightly raised long shields, lightly gripped spears. Only someone who had lived a lot and had a careful eye could understand these signs and evaluate what they saw. When the large man thought he was close enough, he slowly put his left hand into the loose, white linen robes and pulled out a silver amulet. Without pausing, he didn't introduce himself or say anything. There was no need, as the soldiers who saw the amulet suddenly reverted to their initial positions, allowing him and the young man to pass as if ignoring their presence. This was a rare occurrence, because rarely would one of their brethren have to secretly enter during the day through the front gate. A horse can cover a distance of 20 kilometers by running. Its speed can range from 40 to 60 kilometers per hour. However, if there's a saddled, armored, armed, and hefty man on the horse, equipped with a shield and a spear, the situation changes. The knights, realizing this over time, had been training their horses regularly to make them more resilient. Still, they had no chance of catching up with the lightly armored Turcopoles or the Arab cavalries. Fortunately, the place they were heading to was not very far, as the man atop the white horse was urging his horse ruthlessly with spurs. Bernard de Sonnac and his men, headed towards the eastern gate, burst through it like a storm. Bernard de Sonnac, who had long forgotten about whipping the foolish peasant who had slowed him down, was a handsome man with a handsome face, tall stature, broad shoulders, deep blue eyes, and golden blonde hair that made women sigh. With his newly polished chainmail, white robe, and white horse, he looked like a handsome prince from fairy tales. In front of them stood the Mount of Olives. Though it was actually just a modest hill, it was considered a sacred place for all three religions. According to the Quran, a bridge made of a fine thread would be established between Al-Haram and the Mount of Olives to distinguish believers after the resurrection. Those who could cross this bridge would go to heaven, and those who couldn't would go to hell. Jews believed that the Messiah, the Savior of the Jewish people, would come from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem on the Day of Judgment. Hence, many Jews were buried here. Beyond the Mount of Olives, a farmhouse surrounded by low stone walls came into view. After passing through the garden full of olive trees, they saw a two-story house. City guards were waiting for them. Seeing the white-horsed man, the city guards instinctively straightened their postures. The city guards were also controlled by the Templar Knights. The Templars paid their salaries, acquired their equipment, weapons, and horses, and provided their training. Bernard struggled to stop his horse, dismounted hastily, and was about to run to the house when the elderly city guard, thickly mustached with his mustache curled up on both sides, intercepted his path. "My lord," the elderly city guard said. "Where?" Bernard asked, attempting to pass him. "Inside, my lord," insisted the man, not yielding to Bernard's attempt to bypass him. Bernard looked at the man first with anger, then with curiosity. The sergeant had never hindered him before, never gotten in his way, never shown any disrespect. Bernard, being a noble or a knight, could easily punish or whip him. Still, his rational and reasonable feelings held Bernard back. "Lord de Sonnac, please don't, because Lord Payanes," the man said, sounding disheartened. "What?" Bernard asked, pausing. The elderly man pointed to the pale-faced young city guards coming out of the two-story stone house and said, "Not just killed, my lord, but great disrespect has been shown." Bernard's jaw muscles tightened. He took a deep breath, nodded, and Arnaldo de Payanes, Bernard's master and mentor, was inside. His face reddening with anger, Bernard walked heavily towards the house. Arnaldo de Payanes was the former marshal of the order in Jerusalem. He was responsible for military decisions such as the purchase of horses and equipment, and the management of regional commanders. Retirement was not an option in the order, and Payanes had not requested such. The old man had lost his left arm in one battle and his right leg in another. However, at that time, he claimed he could still perform more duties and had moved to one of the order's estates, managing a farm. During this time, his assistant, Godfrey de Sonnac, took over the role, and Godfrey's son and Arnaldo's apprentice, Bernard, had taken the oath of loyalty to the temple. Whenever the young man felt troubled or doubtful, Arnaldo had been his mentor. Bernard loved Arnaldo as much as his own father. Therefore, as he entered through the door, he looked for a place to stand that he could barely bear. He had witnessed many conflicts, but for the first time, he was seeing such rage, such malice. The old man was unrecognizable, his eyes, ears, and fingers were severed. One of the city guards was about to cover the corpse with an old blanket when Bernard, with a stern gaze and a hardening expression, said, "Stop, we need to examine the victim." He wiped away all expressions on his face, just as Arnaldo de Payanes had taught him. The city guard looked at Bernard first, then at the old man, lowered his head, and withdrew. Bernard approached Arnaldo de Payanes with a deep sigh. The old man was sitting in a high-backed chair at the end of his long table, his arms and legs tightly bound, and a rope securing him around his chest due to having only one arm. There were deep wounds on his wrists, and the smell of burnt flesh reached Bernard as he got closer. When the old man approached, he noticed pieces of blankets hung on the windows and signaled them to the city guard. When the city guard lowered the blanket, a column of sunlight filled the room with swirling dust. When Bernard saw the wounds on the illuminated old man, he recoiled, grumbling. Every piece of Arnaldo de Payanes had been meticulously mutilated. Bernard murmured a prayer, seeking mercy and patience from God, and asked, "Servants?" There were 15 workers during the day and 4 at night. The morning workers came in, noticed the closed doors and windows, and entered. When they saw this place, they ran to the door. 2 of the night workers were in the back, 1 on the stairs, and 1 near the back door. "My lord," said the sergeant in charge of the city guards. "A theft, probably," said the sergeant. "Lately, gangs have been roaming from farm to farm." Bernard's blue eyes turned to the golden inlaid sword on the mantelpiece and the large silver cross on the cabinet behind Arnaldo de Payanes, next to the silver cups. Shaking his head, he said, "Not theft or anything of the sort." "Send word to the nearby gates," he instructed. "Find out if there was anyone unusual who entered this morning. It's not a simple theft," he added, turning his back to go outside. At that moment, he saw a thin, dark red line on the wall. It was prominent on the cream-colored stone wall. He approached and looked at the line of tiny droplets forming a trail of blood. He knew this was important, but he couldn't figure out its meaning. "Leaving the knights and men behind," he said with sorrow, "you can figure that out now." The wall surrounding the temple was not as thick as a castle wall but had been turned into a reliable fortification. The gate, fashioned like a castle entrance, was wide enough for 3 horses to abreast and had a high ceiling. After the second gate, one entered the first courtyard. In this courtyard, there was an area for 20 knights' horses, with posts and troughs for the horses. In front of this initial open space and on both sides were slender high windows, designed for the newly fashionable crossbow archers. In this courtyard, there were apprentices tethering, saddling, and arming prepared, saddled, and armored horses. Most of them were not sworn members of the Brotherhood. Some worked within the community to be accepted into the Brotherhood, trying to serve and work their way up, while others were paid servants. They were called servients within the Brotherhood, handling everything from blacksmithing to cleaning. During wartime, they could also participate in battles as infantry or lightly armored cavalry. All of them, as expected, wore black and brown attire. Within the Brotherhood, there was a distinction among the Templars. The Servients were like load-bearing pillars at the center of the Brotherhood, supporting the main structure, the Knights. The Knights were referred to as millets, wearing white or red-crossed attire. Most of them were from noble families. To join the Brotherhood, they had to donate all their land and wealth in accordance with the principle of poverty. They spent most of their time in combat training and, in the remaining hours, prayed like monks. The Knights in the courtyard were waiting under thick awnings, drawn for shade, at a long, old table. This was a simple but effective method the order used, as saddling horses and donning armor took time. In the event of an unexpected attack, these 20 knights waiting in the streets of Jerusalem or within the temple could easily hold attackers until their brethren were ready. This group of mounted warriors, ready for battle, took turns in quarter-day shifts. The large man, with a glimpse at these young knights, lowered the fabric of his helmet that covered his face when he saw an old, heavily worn shield placed on an arched niche at the entrance of the courtyard. He took a deep breath. He had finally returned home after almost 7 long years and countless adventures. He unsheathed his sword. It looked like a regular sword in its black sheath, but the hilt was longer, with handguard and pommel sections in red. The knight fastened the sword to his belt and turned the knight ring on his finger. At that moment, when the warhorse stamped its hooves forcefully on the ground, the man, gently patting its neck, said, "Yes, Lupus, we're home," and dismounted. Horses live for 25 or 30 years, and the warhorse, having seen at least 15 winters, shook its head grumpily, forcefully striking its hooves on the ground. During this, the young man, lowering his own hood, looked around. He couldn't be more than 17 winters old. His eyebrow was divided due to a scar, and there were deep scars on his chin, lip, and nose. A chubby monk, who had tied a thick rope to his brown robe like most of the scribes who met the religious needs of the order and also maintained written records, hurriedly approached, as if his big belly would fall if not held. Clericus, with a red face due to the effort in his class, a cute and smiling man, said, "Welcome, welcome." The burly man introduced himself to the curious monk, saying, "Allain de Bures, Senior Knight." After the monk's eyes narrowed for a moment, he greeted him respectfully, "Welcome back, my lord." Then he clapped his hands looking at the thin, unkempt, tall blond man next to him. The blond man approached the horse and said, "Your horse, my lord? If you're staying, let's put him in the stable," with a lazy and indifferent expression, as if he was exhausted from the heat. Allain continued to look around and said, "I'll stay. The horse's name is Lupus." He then turned to his servant, "Boy, go with them," he said. When the red-haired young man, without speaking, just looked at him, Allain added, "Yes, warn them about Lupus, and come to me when you're done with your tasks." The young man nodded his head and said, "My lord?" As he looked at the horse, then pushed the red-haired man and tried to bite his foot, his shoulder. The young man defended himself from these as if they were ordinary daily things, while the monk's assistant, unable to escape the horse's sudden turn, regretfully held his nose and sighed. Allain, feeling sorry for this, said, "Lupus is a war horse, brother. He is quite ill-tempered and ruthless." The thin man said, "Understood, my lord," still holding his nose and groaning. The young man who was pulling the mules looked and said, "My lord, I also need to record the young man's name. In the ledger, write Allain de Bures and his servant from Bordeaux, my esteemed brother." The monk asked, "Should we record him as a slave, my lord?" It was clear that recording a Christian knight or any infidel as a slave was considered unusual. Moreover, a Templar knight having a slave was also forbidden. Above all, the first vow of the Brotherhood was poverty. "Yes," said Allain to the man who looked longingly inside. The young man with blue eyes seemed to have heard, understood, and ignored them. "Oh, and he's a slave or a servant? If he's not from our Brotherhood, he can't enter armed." The young man heard this and reacted then, turning sharply, staring harshly at the monk and Allain, raising one eyebrow. Allain nodded while the monk stammered, "The rules. Actually, Brother Bruno Brazio saw hundreds of knights every day, joked with them, ate with them, prayed with them. Many of them were warriors who had seen war, killed someone at some point. They all occasionally displayed their warrior nature, but there was something else in the young man's gaze. Something colder, more lethal. If Brother Brazio's years were spent in war, if he spent his life on horseback, with a sword instead of being a scribe for the brotherhood, he would understand the child's murderous gaze.